Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Cherie Danielle, CEO and Chief Executive Creative Director at 4K More Creative. And we exist to create content that shifts mindsets towards a more equitable, inclusive, and beautiful world. And for this Women's History Month, we are bringing to the couch women who are changing the world in business, in their community, and in the arts. And today, we have Tamara Carpenter from TKC Consulting, and we are going to talk about cultural intelligence. This is a tasty, delicious conversation that is so necessary in a world that is divided and has so many opinions. So thank you so much, Tamara, for joining us.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
I'm excited to have you, girl. This is an amazing conversation. Yes. So cultural intelligence, Tamara, I am so excited that I was able to meet you at a time in my life where in my leadership, I am very focused on growing, very focused on wanting to be a good CEO, wanting to bring diverse talent into my company. Yes. But with diverse talent comes a lot of nuances and you know, systems and processes that we're trying to put in place, but also trying to be equitable and, you know, make sure everybody has what they need to get the job done. So there's all these cultural things that come to the table when you put a whole bunch of diverse people together. So you've been helping me a lot to like really grow in this, but people who are listening right now are going to be like, what the heck is cultural intelligence, and who is Tamara, and why is she an expert in this field? So first, tell us your origin story. How did you get excited about, passionate about cultural intelligence?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a journey. So I lived in Portugal for about 17 years, and we had a business there. And in retrospect, I'm not at all happy with the way I entered into a new culture. I wasn't aware of my own culture. And so that process for myself, I began to actually try to assimilate into that culture and become Portuguese, which is actually impossible. And so I was feeling a tension. I thought that's what I was supposed to do. And then actually when I came back to the States is when it was actually worse. It's because I felt like I should be part of the culture, but I didn't feel like part of the culture. And I didn't realize at the time that I had changed so much. So there was a conflict actually in myself, and I was trying to understand actually who am I and how do I integrate into a culture, because integration is really the goal. It's not assimilation.
What's the difference?
So assimilation is when someone tries to become that culture, or they may be forced to become that culture. An integration is where you maintain your identity of who you are. You know who you are culturally, but you recognize that there are differences, and so you adapt, but you don't lose your own values or your own individuality. And that is the goal. And so I didn't realize that. And when I came back and I was struggling so much, that's when I began really digging in and realizing it's not just for when you go cross-culturally that cultural intelligence is important. If you really think about it, we have, you know, departments that are a culture. We have teams that are a culture. We have companies that have cultures, families that have cultures. And that's where I began to realize that some of these same characteristics need to be applied, and it's important to be applied in these settings as well.
Tell us a little bit about the culture you grew up in your home when you were a child.
Oh, yes, and that plays a huge part. Thank you for that, because cultural intelligence actually is touching on that space where we have absorbed our own culture, or not our own, we have absorbed a culture over the time that we're in our elementary school years, and that actually becomes an unconscious influence on the rest of our lives. My personal growing up was in a large family, 2 sets of twins, very dysfunctional, absent father, mother who was came from an addictive family. So it was very chaotic. We raised ourselves, and each child has their own role in that kind of a setting, and I became the peacemaker.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So do you feel like when you went to Portugal, that's why you felt like you needed to assimilate, because you were just trying to be a peacemaker? You were just trying to do what everybody else was doing, make sure you didn't rock the boat?
I think that's part of it.
Okay.
And I think I didn't have a clear sense of myself. And that's the differentiation piece, where I hadn't been able to do the work because I hadn't been safe. So I just carried on the way that I was accustomed to, being invisible, like you say, trying to adapt quickly or assimilate to not make waves, but also, be liked, fit in. And again, fitting in at the end of the day is not unlike assimilation.
So some people listening may be like, okay, so is cultural intelligence, diversity, and inclusion work, is there a difference?
Okay, so in my opinion, diversity, equity, inclusion work is so amazingly important, but it's missing cultural intelligence because you said it in the very beginning. You're bringing together a team, you're bringing together people that you want to intentionally create a diverse environment and have voices at the table. When we do that, we automatically also invite confusion and frustration and difficulties, and we don't know how to actually work and adapt and help each other strategize to work well together. And that's exactly what I feel is missing, because you can bring diverse voices to the table, and you see that companies doing that so much. And then there isn't a cultivated space that is receiving them where they'll feel safe. And so often you cause a situation for that person to be doubly oppressed or doubly frustrated, and they end up having to leave because they haven't been received.
Ooh, okay. So we don't want that happening,
No.
Especially if you are trying to build a culture of diversity, equity, inclusion, and you want to be culturally competent. So my question is, how does one know how they perceive themselves, first and foremost, right? Like, what are your cultural biases, in a sense, or preferences or values? And then how do you know that about someone else? And then you mentioned this thing called sunglasses. We all come in with these sunglasses. So tell me a little bit more about how we form these opinions and thoughts.
Okay, great. So like I said, cultural intelligence is the skill at working and leading well in a multicultural, diverse setting. Okay, so it's a skill that you develop over time. And I think the analogy would be helpful here in that have you ever worn sunglasses? You've come in from a dark or a bright space. You've come into a room, and then you're still wearing your sunglasses. It's hard to see. You're kind of like, oh, wow, I got to take these off so I can see better, right? Well, have you been in a room where someone walked in and they had their sunglasses on, but they actually didn't take them off? So kind of go through with me your thought process,
Usually it's like superstars or rock stars, and like, so either they were high or like drinking the night before and don't want anybody to see their eyes, or maybe they have a light sensitivity or a hangover or a headache or a migraine.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so it could be a black eye, it could be a lot of things, right?
We don't know.
But at least in my I go through a progression, right? I give the benefit of the doubt. I'm looking and saying maybe they have this sensitivity, or they have a situation where they're needing to protect their eyes, because sunglasses are for protecting our eyes, right? But then when they leave them on longer, and I'm watching, okay, this isn't the case, and then their behavior, and I'll be watching for a while, and then if they don't take them off, and I realize, wait, this person isn't very accessible, and what are they hiding, and I can't reach them, then I'll begin judging, right? I was like, okay, so they think you're too cool, I'll have these, attitudes. So just imagine that everybody in the room has sunglasses on. So everybody is questioning the other person, or not seeing clearly, or their perception is off, or they're bumping into each other, or their reactions. The sunglasses would represent our individual culture that we have looked through all our lives, and it's many times unconscious. So cultural intelligence is like taking those sunglasses off and choosing other lenses that allow you to see yourself better and the other person. And I do have an analogy for this as well. I wear contact lenses, and my ophthalmologist suggested, okay, you are old, you're getting older, so more mature. And you need to see close and far, right? You have this challenge. So I'll suggest you use one contact to see near and one to see far. And he said, trust me, your brain is going to adapt. And so I did that, and yes, my brain adapted. So I can look closely and I can look far. And that's a good example, I think, where we begin to look at ourselves through a different lens and try to see more clearly our own perspective and challenge that. And then look at the other with curiosity instead of judgment. And that part is the work of gaining cultural intelligence.
Well, what would motivate someone to want to do this? Because at the end of the day, you're like, this is my culture, this is who I am, this is how I see things, and that's it. Like, how does someone get to a place where, like, maybe this isn't working for me, right? Or maybe this isn't working for my team, or this isn't working for my business. So what's a pain point that would show up to say, hey, maybe I need to take off my sunglasses and really understand how other people are perceiving the world, themselves, and maybe even me?
Okay, I think a great example is a leader who wants to be more inclusive. Because if they're not thinking this way, then they're going to continue creating an environment that may be unsafe. And we can tell potentially it's because there's attrition, people are leaving, or there's no engagement, or there's frustration, or that leader just simply wants to be better, to do better. We want to grow and become more efficient or more effective. So I think a number of ways, but usually there's tension.
Okay.
Usually there's, a sense of, I think I can do better, or I want to be involved in a place that's more inclusive, but I'm frustrated, or people are frustrated.
You talked about being safe. So I took a course on DEI, and one of the things that really stuck out to me is this idea of safety is really psychological. The psychological safety that you feel when you walk into a space or in a team, to feel like you can actually show up as yourself, with your thoughts and opinions and views, with your culture, right? With your story, and that would be welcomed at the table, not just your skills, right? But your voice, your background, your story. And that's a lot to bring to work. So people who are really trying to build these kind of climates, I mean, they're really trying to do something monumental, because like you said, it can get messy really, really, really fast, right? So when we talk about story, some people might freak out and be like, my story don't belong at work, at the boardroom. You all, that's my personal business. So let's talk about how our story informs, and how much of our story should show up in the boardroom, at work, in our teams. And why does it matter?
Okay. It's a great question. And I really do think it's the responsibility of the leader first. Because leaders who are humble and willing to be vulnerable can be a huge catalyst for creating an environment where someone else can feel and begin to feel safe enough, right? If they're asking the right questions. But the story that I'm talking about is the work-related behaviors and attitudes that we're unaware of, that the assessment that we use allows us to go kind of a little bit deep into, not deep, but it allows us to have a framework to begin questioning ourselves, what are my attitudes and assumptions and behaviors and habits and values around work? And those many times, like I said, are internal. They haven't been examined yet. And it's not, the story part is really, how do I approach work? How do I come and like you said, in the setting where everyone wants to show up as themselves, we see a lot of people leaving because they don't feel valued, seen, and heard, right? Many times it actually has to do with cultural factors that are conflicting with each other. And so just elevating that conversation, having language for it, is where the story comes in. And we can say what our values are.
So I could see, if you're working in a space that feels like your culture, your voice, your values are not, welcomed, that can be psychologically, physically, mentally, emotionally taxing and draining. So if you're in that type of a space, because we're going to get to that space, especially as you're trying to work through it, it's going to get tense, it's going to get messy, there might be conflict. A lot of times people don't know how to deal with it, and it turns into as a hostility, right? So if you're working through this work with a team, and it gets messy, it gets tense, do you just quit, blow up? Like, what do you do in those moments to regulate and get back to center?
Okay, that's a really good question as well. First of all, the way that we work is bringing up objective topics. These are preferences. These are objective. It's not going into subjective areas. So that's one way of keeping it, and above the surface, or, talking about things that are not, fiery or, going to stimulate that. But there are areas where we need to understand each other better, and sometimes it's taxing. So we have another assessment we use that gives a skill that I think is it's so helpful. It's called the Brain States Profile. And it helps people to understand their tendency to work from either a low brain state, which is, when we're in fight or flight and our reactions are really closed because our perception gets small, our choices are limited, and our reactions are big. And then the middle brain state is more where we're functioning, but we actually are not functioning well at our greatest, highest brain state. We're just functioning, right? And then the higher brain state is when we're more open to learning and, we're more open to everything, right? Open-mindedness. So we do train and help teams and leaders learn how to move toward that higher brain state on a regular basis. So they're more consistently open, more open.
Now, I like to break things down into like a real story, practical way. So we talked about a story where I felt like one of my values was not necessarily being welcomed with a client recently. And one of my values is that I really value high creativity, like, imagination, ideation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the assessment and a little bit about how I think and do what I do. Yeah. But because it was becoming a tense situation and a hard situation, what was happening for me is I was starting to get to a place of a low brain state where I started to question if who I was, like you said, losing who you are. Like when you start to lose your bearings, that's when things really start to knock you out as a leader, and it just brings you to a space where you're not leading from your best space, and you're not even living from your best space. So had that situation, and I was like, I got to get myself back to a higher, we call it vibration in the world today, like a higher vibration, And so I went to this Oscars event downtown in LA. I drove myself there, dressed myself.
So amazing. So amazing.
I said, I am going to go celebrate high creativity, high production. I'm going to get myself back into that space because that's where I thrive. Now, maybe this wasn't a value for this particular client. That's their value. And I can accept that, but that's not where I thrive. So I need to make sure I get back to that state because that's where I'm going to be successful. And literally it shifted everything in me to put me right back to where I needed to be. Is that an example of like regulating and getting to a higher brain state?
Absolutely. Okay. It's exactly that. You did something, you took an action, you were aware of your body and you made choices. And that's huge because you're planning ahead of time. So this is what the training is about, is that you recognize your body is reducing. You're becoming smaller and you're tense, right? You're calling in. And so you made a choice that you wanted to step back into that identity that you have and where you feel you're most productive and open. So you made that choice. And I mean, that's a big choice. Not everyone's going to be able to do that. I loved what you did because it actually, I could, when you were expressing it, you could see the joy. You could see that you were engrossed in that and that you were happy, right? But yes, it is. There are steps that we can take that help us individually to transition more quickly.
Because at the end of the day, not every leader, not every organization is going to be operating in cultural intelligence. And we're going to have to navigate that, especially as people of color. We come with a culture that hasn't been dominant. It's actually going to start becoming more because multiculturalism is actually growing with children under 5. The majority of children under 5 are multicultural. So now they're not only bringing a culture to the table, they're going to be bringing multiple cultures to the table.
Absolutely.
So it's going to get hard at times, and not everybody's going to want to take off the sunglasses. So as we are navigating, right, when we talk about microaggressions and all these things that happen in workspaces to almost demonize difference, don't demonize difference, but demonize difference, make you feel small so that other people can feel like they're right and in power and maintain their, leadership, their hierarchy, their dictatorship. Anyways, when we go through all of that, how in the hell do you stay grounded and centered? And I think that there's that big thing that I did, but there's smaller things that you can do in the middle of those moments so that trauma, so that smallness, so that psychologically unsafe thing does not get stuck in your body and you can continue to operate at your highest level. What can you do in a moment when something happens and culture is just thrown out the window and it's just a hot mess? What's something you can do immediately? You're in a meeting. What can you do?
So I think you've heard so many times from even other spaces, but breathing is the biggest because we hold our breath generally when we end up being in a tense space. We can find ourselves all of a sudden not breathing at all. And that is the fight or flight. So the choice to actually give ourselves that pause. It could even be, hey, I need to take a break. Maybe it's just go to the restroom or something, but get out of that space. Or you pull back and breathe. So there are breathing techniques that you can do to help you, center again. If you are able to take a walk, bilateral stimulation is important. You can even do tapping without people knowing, right? So tapping is bilateral when you go, one side to the other. It's involved. It's what it does is it actually balances your brain.
Okay.
And gets it, balances basically.
So that's why they say take a walk.
It is.
Let's just take a walk. Yep.
It is. There's a real
right, left.
Yeah. And I think taking your thoughts captive, right? So that's another thing is there are ways to, for instance, counting, not accounting. I don't like accounting, but counting, you can do something in your head, count by numbers that aren't easy for you. So by sevens, count by sevens, count by eights. And then you have to think, and that thinking process brings you back into a space where you're not, you can't do those two things at the same time. You have to be focusing, and that helps to bring down that heightened.
There was a breath exercise that you recently walked me through, and I liked it. It was the ocean breath.
Yeah.
So this is something you do when you're in a meeting and no one's really going to notice because it's really a mentality thing. It's like breathing in the ocean and breathing out. So the wave type of thing, is that what it is?
Yeah. Well, it's actually, you can choose. Okay. It's an imagination, because when you're using your mind again, you're separating from that that other experience you're having. So it's really to imagine. You can see your breath coming in. Okay. So when you breathe in, so if you were just right now, you take a breath in, and you're imagining you see the breath coming into your body, and now you breathe out. And you see it. It's almost like you can make it what you want that's coming out. Or you can make it words, peace. And then breathing out.
I would probably, I think one of the things for me is like, I am seen. I belong and I am loved. Because ultimately, every single person, no matter where you're from, what country, what ethnicity, what gender, we all have an innate desire to be seen, to be heard, to belong, and to be loved. And so that's really what's happening at the table when things start to go awry, is that we've lost a sense, in my opinion, of our humanity, the diversity of our humanity, and the innate need that everyone, you, me, everyone wants to be seen, wants to be heard, wants to be loved, and wants to belong. And that, some people might say, well, that's a euphoric idea. Like, we really can't really get there. Is it a euphoric idea, though?
I don't know. I'm looking at, the fact, again, I think the responsibility for modern leaders. Are modern leaders. To be able to recognize that they're working with humans. They're not. It's not about production. It's about the relationship, or at least understanding that each individual cannot be stereotyped or categorized, because we don't know what we don't know about the people in our world. So the only way we can know is actually if we look at ourselves first and create space to be able to intentionally know the other. And that's why I think being seen, valued, known is possible. If that is the space that's provided by a leader. And that's where the sunglasses analogy is being able to take off those sunglasses intentionally. And intentional leadership, modern leadership, intentional leadership is about that, I believe. So I went to a place called Onsite. You can look it up, those who are listening, but it's in Nashville, and it's also in California and out by San Diego. And we went through a training on emotionally intelligent leadership. And a lot of what we talked about was our own biases and like, how do we look around a situation from several different angles to see how other people are seeing it, to see how you see it, to see how someone else is seeing it. And we did this practice where we did role play. So we were able to go back to a situation where culturally there was a misstep, like both people didn't understand. So I went back specifically to a white pastor, a white evangelical pastor. Someone played the white evangelical pastor, and I was Cherie, and I was able to replay the conversation. Now what happens is you're able to mirror. So
basically what happened was, say you're the white pastor, and I'm sure I was able to say, hey, when Black Lives Matter was marching in front of our church, and you said it didn't matter, and all we should worry about is that, you know, Jesus will come back someday. I don't understand how you said that, because those are my people, and they're crying out for you know, equality, and they're calling out to be seen. And there's obviously a tension in our city, and as spiritual leaders, we need to be there. Yes. And hold space for this conversation. And as a Black woman, I feel like if we don't look at this as important, then I'm not important, right? So I can say that. Yes. And then basically what happens is we switch. So now you would be me, and I would be the pastor. Okay. That's interesting. And you have to say to me what I just said, but now I'm receiving it. Yes. As I'm him. Interesting. Yes. And so what happened, like literally this role play back and forth. And so as I said it to him, then I have to think, how would he respond? Like what context is he coming from? And so I was able to unpack when I could then respond, because then we switched, and I had to respond on his behalf. And I said, well, Cherie, that's interesting. Yeah. You know, this was supposed to be my retirement plan, this big church. And, you know, I'm older now, and what you're asking me to do is going to cause such a rift in our very conservative white congregation. And that wasn't a part of the plan. And so I really struggled with putting this topic in the forefront, because it could mean my whole retirement plan. Right? Oh, wow. But like, that's so like, that's a way you can use like imagination and like, and really like breaking down. Because I did know some of that about him. And when I really critically thought, like, he could be thinking that, like, that could be a thing, because he was terrified to bring it up. Yes. Now, 2 years later, the city did burn, sadly, because of the murder of George Floyd. So that part. But at the same time, I think, why was he struggling to make, in my opinion, an obvious move as a leader? You could never have guessed. Never have guessed. Yep. And never still can guess. No, you know? Of course. But what happened is, in that role play, I was able to at least come up with some theories, possibly, that I could understand a little bit more clearly what could be some critical things culturally that he was dealing with, emotionally, you know, that he was dealing with. So it was a great exercise. I bet. And that's some baby steps toward being able to have empathy, even though maybe not agreeing with the reasoning behind the reaction. Definitely. So Cherie, that's actually a great example of developing or practicing cultural intelligence, because you're trying to understand the other person's perspective. When you did that, did you feel more powerful about it? Afterward? I did. I felt more compassionate, more empathetic, more powerful, because I was able to have a conversation that I wasn't ever really able to have, because it just wasn't psychologically safe. But it helped to release that conversation from my body, put me in a good brain state, and then also just kind of agree to disagree and know that it was what it was. Like, that was his truth at the time. This is my truth at the time. And my truth is still my truth, and his truth is still his truth. And I think like accepting that and being able to walk in that and not let it hinder me from my own power as a leader is super duper important. And even speaking of power, when I refer to power, it's not a dominant power. It's actually an internal settledness, an internal, like I call it a unique confidence, because it's yours. No one else will have the same way of entering that space as you will. But cultural intelligence allows us to own ourselves better and then show up in a way that is like this, you know, more settled and able to empathize and be in the space with someone else, and then maintain our individuality afterward. Yeah. Now you have an exercise that you use within your coaching. Yeah. So what is that? Yeah, it's similar, but there are 3 points. So you have the individual, or the two individuals that might be having a conflict, and then you have a third imaginary individual, and that is actually where you place the problem. So let's just pretend you had the problem is here, and you're looking at the problem. Okay. So you would look at the problem from your perspective. You would look at it, try to look at the problem from, you like step into the space of the other person and look at the problem from their perspective. They would do the same. But the interesting difference is that the problem itself would be looking at you.
So the problem would be like a person saying, I'm looking at these two individuals and what do I wish for them?
Wow. Okay.
And then they have a voice. That problem has a voice. So you have to actually imagine what that would be. And once you bring that third element in, it makes you think, what could be the possibility of our relationship or our working together? So it just brings another element in.
I love that. That's wonderful. It's kind of like mediation.
A lot like that. It's an imaginary mediator.
An imaginary mediator. Okay. So there is obviously ways to figure out what our cultural backgrounds are, what our cultural biases are, what our preferences are, and then what our values are. And I think that that's important to understand, that there are ways that we might be needing to change some of our cultural expression. We're not talking about race here. We're talking about how are you raised? What things do you do? That could just be behavior you learned. Yeah. But it's not necessarily how you want to live. You explained this to me, like, maybe I'm a very flexible person, kind of like flighty. I like things all over the place. But maybe I don't really like that. Maybe I actually want order. But all I've learned because of my family of origin was just dysfunction, that things are just always all over the place. So I've just gotten used to living like that. So now we're talking about changing yourself, like changing your behavior, right? And changing how you culturally show up to best serve what you want in your life. I think this is empowering, going back to power. Yes. Understanding that not even everything that you are will always be. Yes. And you have a choice. Yes. I think that's dope because that's called growth. Growth mindset is super important as a leader to understand that people and things and situations can change. Yes? Yes. All right, so we're going to look at some assessments. You gave me an assessment. Yes. All right, so I've learned a little bit about myself, and we're going to break down two things. So we're going to pull it out. All right. All right, so I had to answer a whole bunch of questions, and this says personal cultural blueprint for Cherie Danielle, and we've got all kinds of different things on here about how Cherie Danielle shows up everywhere. So let's just take a few of them. Let's talk about change. My cultural blueprint on change. So what's my score there? What are you seeing there with my score?
Okay, so these are good points. When we take a cultural assessment like this, there's no right or wrong. Okay. It's a preference. And in these, we're looking at work-related preferences. Okay, work-related. So all that we're doing now is thinking, and then that leaves it into an objective space. Okay. Right? So in this case, then, one of the dimensions was a comparison between flexibility and order around how we deal with change. Okay. So we'll have a 0 to a 5. And again, there's no right or wrong, but some people will show up stronger on one or the other. And when we look at the edges, then we'll know someone really prefers this. Okay. Right? And you showed up with you're preferring flexibility over order in this area of change. That means that you're comfortable with ambiguity. You don't mind being in a space where it's happening at the moment and you can adapt.
Now, it was a scale of 0 to 5, and I'm a 0, meaning you're like 0. I want 100% complete flexibility. Is that what it means?
You're very comfortable in chaos. No, you're comfortable in spaces that aren't defined for you. Okay. You're comfortable with that. Whereas on the other side, it would be someone who prefers order. And if they really prefer order, then they feel most comfortable when there's a strong structure that they can follow and there's not a lot of ambiguity. So just take it, just a thought. Think about our world in the last couple of years in the workspace. It's just so much change and so much ambiguity. Some people are okay with that. A lot of people are not. And so there was a lot of change that happened. So when we look at the workplace, we're thinking about those things and what happens to a person when they have to live a long time or work a long time in a space that actually is the opposite of what they prefer. Yeah. What it does to them emotionally. And this is where we're getting to the brain states piece, where we're thinking about how we're responding and story. Okay, so so we talked about this. Yeah. And tell me a little bit more how you perceived that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you talk about, I'm comfortable with chaos. And then we talk about, like, are you really comfortable with chaos? Or is this part of, like, just how you've learned to adapt, right? To assimilate, like you shared earlier. So for me, when you were saying that, a memory just popped up. So when I was a kid, depending on my mom's mood, she later got diagnosed as bipolar, but we would be like headed to the water park or headed to somewhere that was really exciting. And if one of us did something that set her off, she would literally turn around the car and we would go home. Like big dreams, big things, big events would literally be turned in a moment. And this happened often. So I had to learn, because it was emotionally all over the place. In addition to that, I don't like cigarette smoke, and my mom, she smoked, and so I would have to lock myself in the room, put a towel underneath the door to try to create a space for myself that I felt was safe. And then eventually I moved into the closet. Like I then moved.
Really?
Yes. Then I moved into a space where I had a safe space in my closet in my room. So when I think about these memories, I just had to keep flexing. I had to keep, I wanted order, but I didn't have it. So I just kept making up spaces. So I don't know what that means.
I think this gets to the point that we look at these as patterns, whether or not they're values that we have or they are habits or behaviors that we adopted over time. And that's where we have the ability to examine unexamined attitudes and behaviors and values and make choices. So in that case, I'm not a therapist, but I can imagine that you created a space and order and structure for yourself to be able to feel safe. And that might be a preference, is to have that. But interestingly enough, because I grew up also in a very chaotic space, because it was comfortable for me and I expected the unpredictable, then I can actually create that for myself. And that's where the learning of saying, wow, that questioning, do I like that? Do I want that? Do I want to change? And behaviors and attitudes that have been adopted over time can be changed, and we get to choose, right? If it was a value of yours, then, and it was just something that was intrinsically yours and part of your identity, you don't want to change that. You want to adapt in a situation to be able to work potentially in a situation that's more order focused. Understanding that might create a lot of tension for you over time if you're forced to be in a situation over time that is the opposite of what you feel comfortable or your preference is. And that's where choice and power of choice comes in. Once you know, then you can think about it and make your decisions.
Let's look at a different one. Let's look at one that I think is actually a value for me. So that one I think it just instinctually is what it is, because I've had to adapt and I'm able to do that. I'm able to be flexible. But let's look at one that's not necessarily just something I adapt to. It's something that I think is actually a value for me. So let's look at power. Equality is 0 to 5. So I'm a 1. And hierarchy is a 5. And I scored 1. So let's talk about that.
So equality, I believe, is right now one of the most important factors. A lot of people say they value equality, but when we look at the systems, they don't show that there's actually equality. So equality is the desire that all, the understanding that everyone is created equal. We all should have access to the same opportunities. Hierarchy, which is the other side of this the scale, is where people are comfortable with different levels of power. What I think is really important to understand is that our culture, our business culture, actually is many companies are hierarchical, even though they might say we value equality. And that's where some of the tension is, because the systems are not allowing for equality. They're fighting against it. And that's the underlying system, right?
So I think for me, being in a company or in a space or working with clients where they don't value equality, because I know this is a value of my company, right? Then they're probably not a sustainable client relationship for me. Or if someone really wants a culture to work for a culture in a company that's very hierarchical, like then probably 4K more isn't the right place, because we're definitely gonna. I'm not changing that one because I'm making a decision not to change that one. Like, this isn't just my bias. I'm like, nope, this is a value of like something I want to stand on.
Okay, so I would call that intentional leadership.
Intentional leadership. Okay.
So you've decided and you know that that's a value for you, and leaders set the tone and the culture of their companies or their teams. So you need to be consistent, because anybody coming into your company, if you were actually underneath and you didn't know it, hierarchical, then you would be going against your own values and setting values in your company that actually are not consistent, and people would know that.
Yes.
They would sense it.
That makes sense. But I think it's good to just like A and B this, because that's a value and I'm not changing it.
No.
Whereas change, flexibility and order, I'm willing to mess with that. Why? Yeah. Because it's just like, I think I just kind of landed here. Yeah, I can be flexible, but I could also use a little bit more order.
Yes.
And I can release other people who might be better at creating order to create the systems, and we can adapt. Like, we're right now working on standard operating procedure. So I'm trying to bring more order to the situation, because I understand that not everybody is as flexible as I am.
And a good piece to remember in that is when we make change, like you say you want to change that, then you're working to create new neural pathways in your brain to accept order as something that's good, because your brain likes to be lazy and will go for the things that are easiest. Yes. So if you choose order, you're choosing to really work at and practice your brain new neural pathways. And you can do that. The more practice you do, you're going to be able to embrace those, or that order better and flow in it. But just to understand, it will be hard because your brain doesn't want to do the work.
Yes. You know, it's interesting, Tamara, because I've brought so many diverse ladies to the couch, and we've talked about, you know, what motivates you as a woman CEO? What, you know, how do you boss up, and how do you, you know, run all these companies? And we've talked about how do you meditate, and how do you own your femininity, and how do you, you know, live at your best artistic self? We've talked about all these things with all these different women, but I think at the end of the day, one of the things that I know is true out of all of these conversations, and you are, you know, putting the frosting on the cake today, that being an intentional woman leader takes intentional work.
It does.
I have coaches. We're taking assessments. We are looking at our own biases. We are trying to understand other people. We are trying to shift things. We are trying to create a bigger table so that we can lead and be more effectively together. And I think at the end of the day, that's why I'm excited that we were able to have these conversations, because not everybody's going to want to do this work, but not everybody's going to be a prolific leader. These women who are on this wall are prolific leaders because they chose to do work. They chose, Frida, to look from other perspectives and bring her perspective to the table. Maya, talking about, always flipping things. You know, Shirley, the first Black woman to run for president. I'm telling you, like, there's so many. Catherine, a NASA superstar. You know, I think, like, for you to make it in this world, and to be someone who's a leader, who will be known and pass the test of time, this is the work.
It is.
This is the work.
Yeah.
And so you're inviting people to the work with your consulting company. And so what could someone expect if they're like, all right, I want to hit up Tamara. I want to learn more. I want to be a better leader. I want to feel like I'm more empowered. I want to be more intentional. How do we hit you up? What do you do? How do we start?
Yeah. Well, I really intentionally seek to create a safe space. Okay. Because we're talking about culture. We're talking about a person's progression into that space of, you know, a more intentional leadership. I focus first on assessments, because that helps the individual to know themselves better, and then begin to have the conversation about story, because I really feel story is important for all that we do. We can't overlook it. We need to revisit it, and then so I'll do 2 assessments, and then I'll debrief, you know, those 2 assessments with an individual, and help them start that journey for cultural intelligence and understanding their brain state. And then I'm a coach. So if there's desire for continued coaching, I'm available for that. Okay. For companies, I provide consulting and coaching as well for teams to help them, like we've been talking about.
Very good.
I do have a surprise for you.
What's that?
So I did put my own blueprint on here,
Okay,
so you and
okay.
I could understand. So you can understand.
Oh, wow.
That there are, if we were to work together, we would have to make some choices.
I love that. She didn't say changes. She said choices.
Yes.
Okay.
And we would have to strategize. So let's just take flexibility.
Okay.
Where you are more flexible, I prefer order. And that makes me feel safer, but not all the way. I'm in the middle, right? And just to say that we can both be flexible, we can both desire order, but there is a preference. I marked down that that communication, indirect, direct communication. We can compare these to each other, and we can compare these to countries.
Okay.
So the U.S. tends to be more direct.
Okay.
Portugal tends to be more indirect, which is where I spent a lot of time. But there's something else I think is important to understand, is that someone who's direct might think an indirect person is is maybe hiding something, or they're not coming out straight up.
Yeah.
And an indirect person might perceive a direct person as being blunt, and they're not really caring for the relationship. So indirect generally wants to protect the relationship and save the relationship, and they see the two, conflict and relationship, intertwined. And they don't want to lose the relationship. Someone who's a direct and sees problem and relationship separate will be able to go straight up to the problem and directly address the problem.
Yes.
And so understanding those two things, then it's realizing that we can preserve the relationship while also attacking the problem.
But that's where your exercise comes in. So if we were working together and we had an issue, I would immediately go to that exercise with you and say, okay, what's your perspective? What's my perspective? Now, what is the problem? I'd put the problem completely in the middle and say, what is the problem saying?
Exactly.
So that will bring us right to the middle, because I'm a 0.
Yeah,
which means
I know,
I'm
and
direct,
I'm a 4.
And you're a 4.
Yeah. Which I think I took this a long time ago. I don't think I'm the same.
Okay.
I'm a 4 anymore.
Yeah.
But the aspect, I think, as time goes by, let's say we had that conversation, when I feel safe, or when you feel safe in a relationship, it's less likely that this will matter as much, because we've created a pattern, right? So an understanding of each other and a trust. And trust is fundamental, and this is why we're doing all of this, is trust is important for relationships and safety. There's a lot of distrust that happens when there are gaps and people aren't understanding how to address them because they're subconscious.
Yeah.
They're unconscious, right? So I marked also time. So your nature, you work in an environment that is time specific, and you look at time potentially as a unit and a value and a measure, where I have been influenced a lot by Brazil, by Portugal. Time is more an event, right? I'll get there, I'll be there, and I can stay longer. It's the relationship, it's the experience, right? So again, there might be some times where we're saying, okay, let's look at this. So I just brought this. I thought it would be fun for you to see that there are gaps.
Yes.
And the bigger the gap, the
and
more
we still
chance.
like each other, but we have some choices.
Exactly. And there's more
choices.
And you can strategize. So this assessment looks at perception. How do I perceive someone who is more direct? How do you perceive indirect?
Yeah.
But then it gives strategies.
I think at the end of the day, I think what you're saying is, when we can share this with each other, then it helps us to not go straight to the big J. What's the big J word?
Yeah, judgment.
Judgment. Because judgment then leads to what?
Yeah.
We write people off, right?
Yeah.
Tension, conflict, so on and so forth. And then we don't even get the opportunity to have this magical relationship, because I've judged you.
Yes, exactly.
And I've written you off as a human. And I think that that's where things get really messy. And I think that for me as a leader, I want to make sure that I'm not writing people off.
Yep.
And I don't want to be written off because of my natural tendency to be direct, or their, natural tendency to be indirect in some ways. And then just understanding that we're both coming as individual people. So what this does is it kind of puts culture and DEI work is not just for people of color. This is for everybody.
It is.
Because now we're taking race as a part of it, right?
Yes.
Family of origin is part of it. Where you live, country is a part of it, right?
Socioeconomic, all of it.
All types of things are a part of it. But I think it goes back to this fundamental idea that, again, we all are unique individuals.
Yes, we are. Exactly.
And if we approach each human that way,
exactly,
then it becomes very magical, and there might be more commonalities that we actually end up having than things that actually set us apart and divide us. So thank you so much for helping us to understand more. And I hope that more women who listen to this, and even men, will reach out to you and really do the work to become dope, intentional leaders. Thanks, Tamara.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for letting me come.
Hey everybody, I hope that you enjoyed the Women History Month interviews. If you are interested in telling your story or bringing your leadership skills in front of my audience, which is primarily artists of color, hit me up at Sheree, SHUREE, at 4kmore.com. Also, if you're like, hey, I need some production work, I need some music work, I need some design work, or I need some social media marketing help, 4K More has got you. We, again, specialize in creating content that helps shift mindsets towards a more beautiful, equitable, inclusive world. Hit us up. Peace.